Welcome back. Happy Monday. And I think it is the last Monday of August. And we'll be off next week, right, Gary? That'll be Labor Day. And so we'll get a nice little 3-day weekend there. But really fascinating show that we have. I always, first off, always awesome to have Jacob. We'll get to intros in a minute. But what I find really fascinating about today's session is we just had Ryan Bonner on last week. And lo and behold, Jacob, as always, follows everything going on with the DIB very closely and puts up a nice little post about the DOJ opening up a federal lawsuit against Georgia Tech and some of its departments that are involved in the Department of Defense, and there's some false claims about their cybersecurity, and we're going to get into that today. We were going to talk about, and we will talk about a little bit about today. Ironically, Gary, the thing that I was planning on talking about today, which kind of came up with Ryan, was the ramifications and how all of critical infrastructure is kind of looking at what happens to CMMC. And I thought it was really interesting because Halliburton, obviously the oil sector, which is a critical infrastructure, they just got a major cyber attack. And so we'll talk some about that too. But so in kicking things off today, I wanted to bring in our legal expert, Eric Tilde, so he'll weigh in on this as well. And so that's setting the stage. Just one thing I'd like to put up here in chat as far as a announcement. On the 19th of September, we are going to be doing an entire business impact assessment. And hey, Lisa, great to see you. BIA, we've been talking about this, Gary, for some time. We're actually going to have Ryan Weeks. We're going to have Brian Blakely and Jerry Craig. Hopefully, you're going to see your schedule, Gary. You'll see if you can co-host with me. But we're literally going to walk through a BIA with a mock MSP. We'll have a persona built, and you're really going to learn how to go through this process. And we're going to actually have a challenge and ability to win some really cool stuff. So that's the URL there.
That'd be really good, Andrew.
Yeah.
Finally, a good announcement.
Should I be like George on Seinfeld and stop now, Gary?
Yeah, because normally when you have an announcement, it's more like that.
All right. Well, let's kick it on off. Jacob, most folks out there know you, and hopefully we'll, as people keep rolling in here, but I'll let you kick it off in terms of an intro, and then I'll kind of, I got an opening question for you here, and then Eric, although we don't have a bunch of legal questions, I'd love for you to chime in there as well on that. So,
yeah.
So
absolutely.
Intro would be great, Jacob.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me back on the show. It's been a while. It's always a fun day whenever the CMMC guy shows up, and Ryan Bonner is a tough act to follow. So the audience is getting 2 weeks of CMMC in a row. So
exactly.
You can only run for so long.
CMMC though. You know what I mean?
For sure. But as we'll talk about, one way or another, all paths are sort of leading back to that type of model. So for those that don't know, I'm Jacob Horn. I'm the Chief Cyber Evangelist at Summit 7. We are an MSP that is specifically focused on facilitating DFARS, NIST, CMMC compliance for defense contractors using the Microsoft stack. Chief Security Evangelist means I don't have a sales quota. So my entire job is basically to do the sense making of all the rules, regulations, standards, policies, and events in and around CMMC, DFARS cyber regulations, and now apparently everything going on everywhere in every sector all the time because, as people probably have noticed over the last few years, the way that the winds are blowing are increasingly regulatory. Mm-hmm. And for one reason or another, what's happening in the defense space, what has happened, what continues to happen in the defense space is not an anomaly. it is a leading indicator for what's coming for everybody else, which is why it's important to pay attention to, even if you don't do defense work or if you're trying to get out of defense work because of what's going on.
Yeah.
Jacob, do you feel like we've been talking about this for so long? I feel like even on the CyberCall, we've been the boy who's cried CMMC.
Yeah.
Even though it was clear talking to Ryan where things are and what's coming. It's almost like I feel like a lot of people are still in that mode where they're not realizing it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
That?
I'd say the majority of people are either in straight up denial or knowingly in denial. Yeah, we were just at Navy Gold Coast, which is like the largest Navy acquisition event of the year in San Diego. And it's basically a gigantic conference at the convention center where they have Comic-Con to give you a sense of scale. And it's all of the Navy systems commands who buy stuff from contractors and all the Navy contractors and subcontractors who sell them that stuff, who get together and they talk about long-range acquisition forecasts and what they're going to be buying and blah, blah, blah. And nobody was talking about CMMC. The government customer wasn't talking about it. The contractors weren't talking about it. And then on the last day of the conference, the people from the Pentagon who were in charge of the program got up there and they said, you guys have been doing this the whole time, right? Because we told you that it's going to take a minute to get through the rulemaking process, but it's not like we're not doing it. And, it was a room with like 1,000 people in it and everybody just stared at her like they didn't know what she was talking about. So you guys remember the movie Speed? You remember the great American cinema classic Speed, where they're all trapped on a bus and the bus can't slow down and, and the bridge is out? We're right about that point in the plot here. The bus ain't slowing down and we're about to fly off the end of this bridge.
And we don't have Sandra Bullock with us.
No, sorry.
Or it'll probably be okay.
Awesome.
Especially a young Sandra Bullock.
So, well, I mean, generational differences aside, it's one of those things. You hear
or
all the time.
Keanu Reeves, whatever you're into.
It's whatever you're into. You hear this all the time. Oh, it's been talked about for so long. It's, crying wolf. It's that, it's this. And anybody who takes 5 minutes to understand how the rulemaking process works and the sequence of events that have occurred realize that this is pretty much normal for how the regulatory process works. It's just how the red tape of the machine works. And so anybody that's let that amount of time fuel their confirmation bias is about to be in a serious problem. It's the big irony here. We can move off of CMC in a second. The big irony here is, Eric, as I'm sure and you've explained, I'm sure Ryan talked about last week. The thing about rulemaking is that agencies aren't allowed to talk about the rule while they're making it. It was actually an anomaly back in 2020, 2019, when DoD was making all this noise. Normally, what's supposed to happen is you only get an update when rules are published. And other than that, they're not supposed to say anything. And so the real irony here is that the less you're hearing about it means the closer it is to being done, which is exactly the opposite of what everybody needs to happen. But it's just a terrible situation. It's just a terrible situation. And it's fueling a lot of confirmation bias.
Well, I'm putting the URL of this most recent, imminent or just pending, if you will, just happened headline about the DOJ filing a lawsuit against Georgia Tech and one of its departments, Jacob. And so this is, the Georgia Tech and the Georgia Tech Department of Research that has DoD contracts, many years of doing business with them. And I mean, if there isn't kind of a case study for really Gary's kind of question to you of the seriousness of this, this could be a landmark case, could it not? And if so, what's going on here? Maybe just kind of unpack what you read.
Yeah, so everybody should check out at least the DOJ press release summary, and I would recommend that everybody at least read through the complaint. It's like 99 pages long, but it doesn't take long to get into the spiciness of the complaint in terms of like direct quotes from former employees of this research section of Georgia Tech. So a couple months ago, Whistleblowers filed a lawsuit against Georgia Tech and the Georgia Tech Research Institute for failing to comply with their DoD cybersecurity requirements. These are the same requirements that are imposed on any other defense contractor. These are the 800-171 requirements, the DFAR 7012 world. These are the things that CMMC is a program designed to verify, right? They are separate things. And so these colleges and universities that do this research that work with covered data from the DoD have the same obligations that a manufacturer would have or that an engineering firm might have. And as it turns out, like a lot of organizations, there were some cultural problems around adopting these requirements and submitting accurate attestations and scores to the government. And some senior folks on their cybersecurity team blew the whistle. And so under the False Claims Act, correct me if I'm wrong here, Eric, but under the False Claims Act, the government can sue organizations for making false claims. But there's also a provision that allows private individuals to blow the whistle. And if they blow the whistle, the government can, if I'm using the correct terminology, join the case. They can essentially take over the lawsuit if the case is strong enough. And that's what's happened here, is that the government, the DOJ, has opted to take over what was people blowing the whistle, which is a really bad sign for Georgia Tech. That's not good. They move very slowly when this stuff happens, but the DOJ, federal prosecutors, folks like that, they generally, they hunt down the last zebra in the herd, right? They take cases they know they can win. So if they actually take over the case, it's going to be a long day for those folks, but it's worth reading because they have direct quotes from these employees. You got chat logs and emails and statements and all this stuff about people going, well, we'll just get waivers, so we won't bother to do it in the first place. They talk about how star researchers win large government contracts. And so as a result, if the star researchers don't want to be constrained by cybersecurity controls, then they get overridden and they just don't do them. One thing that's interesting about the complaint is that the level of technical expertise that's described by the DOJ, like their understanding of the technicality of the controls, is pretty impressive. And so, we can talk about advice, I think, for people listening on this call. My one takeaway for MSPs is you need to be at least as familiar with the nature of the technical controls, scoping, the regulations as the DOJ is, because
but they have unlimited budget, so they should be.
Do they? I mean, every time you talk about DOJ as an entire organization, maybe
for a case. I'm saying for a case,
maybe. Yeah. Either way, you need to be at least as familiar with the controls, especially if you're an MSP that is in charge of your client's security for these things and you're dealing with covered entities. Because, as you said, Andrew, they're going to use this as the model. They're going to use this as the example for going after other people.
So Eric, love your comments here. As a lawyer, what give us your sense on what you're seeing, what you're reading.
I think take the last thing Jacob said. I think you hit it on the head, right? If you think that this is a lone wolf kind of case, you're crazy. I mean, given just take universities, right? Given the number of research universities that there are out there, it's happening elsewhere. We all know it's happening elsewhere. And this is going to empower those IT folks to blow the same whistle, right? I think that much more of it is going to come down, right? It's tough to blow the whistle, right, on your employer. I don't care if you work for a university or a corporation or anywhere else, but once you see what happens in similar situated cases, it's going to repeat itself. I think we're going to see a lot of this.
So you're saying this is the Jeffrey Epstein of CMMC?
That might be. It might be.
So, I mean, one thing to note about the whistleblower provision, right, is, and we were talking about this beforehand, whistleblowers are monetarily incentivized by blowing the whistle. If there are fines levied against companies that are found liable under the False Claims Act, I believe I'm using the right terms, Eric. I'm sorry. I believe it's liable, not guilty. If fines are issued against these organizations and you blew the whistle, you stand to make up to 30% of those fines. You are given those fines. The Aerojet Rocketdyne whistleblower made millions of dollars. He was their cyber compliance officer guy, right? Like W-2, doing his normal job. And they said, hey, you need to sign these attestations to the government that says that we're implemented. And he goes, I'm not going to do that. So they fired him. And he goes, okay, now this is happening. And a couple of years later, he walks away with a couple $1 million.
Yeah, it's no different than
I'm ordering a whistle on Amazon as we speak.
DOJ's just giving them out for Halloween this year. So
My God,
yeah,
I'm over here working like a dog. I could just get a whistle.
Well, it's one of those things where,
make sure it's not a dog whistle though.
Yeah. So, I mean, and Eric, I think this is something that I've heard, attorneys say, in the past is you have to make sure that you are actively working on these things. It isn't like somebody's just going to blow the whistle and you're automatically going to get hammered. But when former employees come out and they say, I know where all the bodies are buried, I've been begging these people to do this work for a long time, and the company or the organization or whoever is putting up roadblocks, saying things like, we don't think it's real, so we're not going to do it. That creates a trail that's going to get you in trouble very quickly.
Yeah.
And I got to think it's situations where it's egregious, because you can have disgruntled people doing stuff. And so I would think they're looking for pretty, like you said, a slam dunk where it's egregious.
I bring this from the perspective of we can all go on Reddit, and it literally seems like every week there's some admin on there that's at their wit's end being like, how do I get the leadership in this company to believe what's going on? And they're struggling to make it happen. And when you have a situation like that, that's why the FCA has treble damages for whistleblowers. I mean, that's the entire purpose. It is something to consider. It's not like it's a guarantee, but if you're not minding your P's and Q's, there's things that could go really wrong here.
Yeah. It's no different than tax cases, right?
Yeah.
You get a spiff if you narc on someone in a tax case.
Yep.
It's all the same.
And the relators bar, right? Essentially the lawyers who have their firms are essentially their entire business model is to help whistleblowers file lawsuits. This is big in the healthcare sector.
Sure.
There's entire law firms who that's their whole purpose is to help facilitate whistleblowers. And when they get wind of the cyber civil fraud initiative actually gaining traction against Georgia Tech, and they know exactly what questions to ask, it's like taking an administrator of a nursing home that's committing fraud. You're taking an IT admin out of an MSP that's committing fraud. It's exactly the same thing. It's just what you're adding up is different, and you've got lawyers who have firms tailor-made to make that happen.
And if you take that to its logical conclusion, or do you think that it's going to result in the right thing? Meaning, do you think it's going to result in people doing the right thing such that they don't get the whistle blown?
Yeah. Well, this is what I'll say about this, and this is what I think is so fascinating about this case is I post a lot of stuff on LinkedIn, and I've been posting for a long time about this space specifically. And I posted this DOJ press release when it came out last week, and it is on track to be, as far as every engagement metric on LinkedIn, the largest LinkedIn post I've ever made, ever. I mean, it has people's attention more than any rulemaking update, more than any FedRAMP memo update, more than any goofy meme I've ever made, right? Like, it is off the charts in terms of virality and engagement.
Mission accomplished.
Consequences get people's attention.
Yeah, Gary, I commented, Jacob this weekend posted that very thing, and I commented, I'm like, it's like rubbernecking when there's an accident. I mean, you and I have been the long-term guys on the CyberCall in our 5th year, trying to do always the right thing, tell everyone what's going on, what they should do, ideally bring on experts, not us particularly, we bring on experts like Jacob and Eric. And, so the analogy I gave Jacob, I'm like, the accident, everybody looks, but give the, hey, drive safely this way, or do these things to improve your driving. No one really cares. Collectively, there's this subset of MSPs that do, but is that just human nature, Gary?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, when you're in business, and small business especially, I mean, it's this way in life. Every day looks a lot like the day before. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? So to see and understand something is one thing. To put a plan together and make changes takes discipline.
Right.
And, and when you run a commercial business, it's hard to fit, new things in there. That's why we talk so much that we have to make these kind of things good business. We have to show them in a way where there's monetarily that you can, like that you can monetize the things you have to do. Because if you can't, and it's just more work and more overhead in an already difficult business for a lot of people with thin profit margins, it's not a good recipe.
So just one quick question. We'll get on track here. Are you asking Jacob a question? But I am curious, with all your years of doing this, what's the fascination about tools and shiny objects? Is it the distraction? Is it the hope that it'll make a difference? Like, why is it that people will, like, you'll get 100 people on hundreds and hundreds of people on hey, there's this new update on a product or something like that, but hey, we're going to talk about this type of discipline to make a difference in your business.
Yeah.
They don't get as much
because I think in general, MSPs understand how to evaluate, buy a tool. And in some ways it's an easy button. You're asking the tool or the, technician that runs the tool to cross that off of the list. When you think about the most important things that we talk about on this show, it's process and discipline. And if you don't have some maturity in your business, if you don't have dedicated roles and a way of implementing, process, across those different roles of what to happen, it's hard, Andrew. It's way, way harder. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's so important now that we talk every week that, there has to be some level of maturation of your business before you can have some more maturity in your security posture, ultimately now to meet regulations that are coming. And we're going to talk about this with Jacob, but I don't mean we're talking about, the DIB, but this is not where it ends.
Right. But I think what you're saying, Gary, is that's why the companies the MSPs that have been the most mature have been able to adopt different pieces of cyber and gain exponentially as a result.
Absolutely. And all of them has made it good business. Those MSPs, they command the highest price, they grow the fastest, they have the highest enterprise value. It worked out for them, but it was hard.
And now maybe it's good business and you get to stay out of jail.
Yes, both. Yeah, right. You stay out of harm's way. And listen, worst case, you could be in this, you could be in a press release, but to a wider and more likely, right, you are just at some point going to lose customers, some that you may be aware of and some that you may not even be aware because you haven't asked all the questions to see whether they might be subject to this, downstream. And it'll be too late then.
Yeah.
And that's more likely, Eric, is that it affects your churn in your business. And
no doubt. And I would think about jail, but true story. One of my clients sent me an article and just last week, and granted the article was like 5 or 6 years old, but it was about an MSP owner that went to jail, and he went to jail because he refused to turn over administrator passwords for a former client, and he was charged with extortion. Right. And my client came across this article and he said, hey, you need to keep me out of jail. Right. So, I'm being a little flippant, but there's definitely a possibility in this Georgia Tech case of maybe criminal charges.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Gary, how about you? I think we have a little bit more of this case where there's a little bit of a quote, if you don't mind reading that, but I think it's really interesting.
So I wanted, basically to set the stage for this, Jacob, just so everybody's up to speed. Obviously, this is trying to send a pretty strong message, right? In at least in the defense industrial base, about compliance with 800-171 now, CMMC. And here's the quote, right? Cybersecurity compliance by government contractors is critical in safeguarding the U.S. informations and systems against threat posed by malicious actors. This comes from Ryan Buchanan, the U.S. Attorney. For this reason, we expect contractors to abide by cybersecurity requirements in their contracts and grants, regardless of the size or type of the organization or the number of contracts involved. Our office will hold accountable those contractors who ignore these rules. That's What are your thoughts when you hear something that aggressive?
Well, I think that the funny thing about people reading it is that that's not the first time that they've said it. I think that there's a long tail of, I've been making content that is primarily taken directly from the preambles of DoD cyber rulemaking since like 2011. And the one thing that they have consistently said in DoD rulemaking, in federal CUI rulemaking, is when you're dealing with the government's data, the minimum requirements don't scale down based off the size of the organization that handles the data. The minimum requirements are pegged to the nature of the data itself. And so when the data flows into smaller organizations, the relative burden for those organizations gets larger and larger. They have admitted this for years. They know that that's the dynamic, right? In this way, 800-171 is really more like a privacy standard than it is a security standard, which probably can help everybody from grasping their pearls every time we talk about 800-171 and CMMC as a security standard. It has major holes in it. Of course it does. It's an assurance standard for data confidentiality. And when you think about it more like the GDPRs of the world, it is a data owner, the government, worried about assurances that its data is being kept confidential when other people are processing it, right? When you're handling their data. And so you wouldn't imagine that there would be some sort of a waiver based on organization size in a privacy standard. But here, because it has the word security in it, everybody goes, well, the risk should be different because an organization is bigger or smaller. 800-171 is a representation of the government's acceptable minimum risk tolerance, right? And so they've already taken all of these things into account, and now we're watching all these things collide. And so when the real trick here, though, is there's other sector management agencies. We were going to talk about critical infrastructure and things like that. The trick with the DoD here is that you have, and I know that people don't like this, Eric, that people don't like this. When you agree to terms in a contract, that's it. It's not like it's some agency kind of sort of trying to be creative with their authority over privately owned businesses, and they were just omni-domni put in charge of this sector because of who they are. You have signed a contractual agreement with the DoD. At that point, if you are left holding the bag, there's nothing that anybody's going to be able to do for you. And that's a really brutal reality, but that's how contract law works. And it's why paying attention to this stuff is so important, because it can lurk under the surface for years and then completely pull the rug out from somebody later on.
Yeah, Jacob, what you mentioned the contracts, and what does the contract say? And I can guarantee you that all of my clients who are on this call are tired of me asking them or responding in response to their question of, well, what do I do? And my response is always, well, what does the contract say? And it's a great point that seems to be table stakes, but it's not.
I don't know if there's a bigger element of law in the United States than how contracts works. I mean, that's what everything is.
So Gary, just before you go to the next one, we're going to talk a little bit about, the whole monetization or fiscal dominance a little bit in this call, but is this also, Jacob, potentially setting the stage of, hey, there's money to be made here? We talked about the whistleblower, but regulatory fines, like the government is going to say, this is an area we're making money. We will extract dollars if you're not following us.
The DOJ has a report every year of the fines that they recover from false claims actions, and they're typically healthcare sector actions, and it's billions of dollars. And now you're talking about, you have existing regulations, existing requirements, existing contractual agreements for DoD contracts that are worth as much, if not more, than the amount of money flowing through the healthcare sector in those contracts. And they have mountains of evidence that people aren't implementing them. You can just walk around random events and people will openly tell you, we're not doing the requirements because we don't think the government's going to do anything about it. Like, if you were to just take a bunch of federal prosecutors to the average DoD acquisition event, they'd probably have a seizure, because people are just like saying things. You get on phone calls with people during engagement, you go around to random events, LinkedIn DMs. I mean, people without signing NDAs will just confess their sins about things that they're not doing, which, we're here to help. But, nobody in the DOJ or the DOD is, of the mind that it's not a complete dumpster fire out there. I mean, if they wanted to, they can make more money off of false claims actions for cyber civil fraud than off of healthcare fraud.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And listen, I know some people that have gone through the process and are contractors for the DOD. It is not easy to get them turn that thing on, but once they turn that spigot on, they don't know how to turn it off. Like, you literally make money until somebody figures out how to stop paying you. And so I feel like that same thing gives them this feeling like everything's going to last forever and nothing's going to, it's like when the stock market's going up or the real estate market, everyone feels it's going to go on forever. And it only goes on until it does. What do I like to say? Look, all these rules aren't an issue until they are.
Right. Right.
Yep.
Yeah. So when we talked to Ryan last week, we had a conversation with him about the concerns about not having enough auditors, just there being this bottleneck beyond, MSP's understanding and moving forward. Just even when you get past that, a bottleneck. Can you unpack a little bit about what you see from your approach?
Yeah, that's not everybody's biggest problem. That is a bottleneck, and it is not the biggest bottleneck, and it's not the first bottleneck that people are going to run into. Everybody keeps saying we don't have enough assessors, as if everyone out there is ready for an assessment, right? Like, that is not the situation. The average company out there won't even qualify for an assessment because they can't answer the basic questions in CMMC phase 1 to get out of assessment feasibility review, right? You're going to have what we call CMMC false starts all over the place. You won't be able to pay a C3PAO to take your assessment. If they knowingly take an assessment and then you don't pass, you're going to sue them. They're not going to open themselves up to people who just don't qualify for assessments. The big bottleneck is not assessment, it's implementation, right? And everyone on this call could max out their portfolio of clients and only take on DoD work, and there will not be enough implementation capacity to get the amount of people through who need it. And that's not the DoD's problem, because everybody has been telling them we're fully implemented and ready to go. That's the whole point, right? CMMC isn't making you do the implementation. All the other DFARS cyber clauses have been making you do the implementation. So people who are waiting on CMMC to become real to start their implementation are going to be 18 months behind schedule at best. I mean, there's a handful of MSPs that are solely targeted on DIB work. A lot of other MSPs kind of dabble in it. We could all expand our capacity by 4 or 5x overnight, and it's not even going to make a dent in the level of demand.
Gary, just Jacob, I saw Chris Lair make a comment and just made me think of something. Like when Chris on the IR side, Jacob, he'll certain regions, he works with MSPs who have feet on the ground that he knows are, really good in, provide a good quality of work. Do you foresee a similar type ecosystem potentially arising for, let's just say, Summit 7, who, you guys are just, have all of a sudden have a backlog of months and months, maybe years of going, all right, we'll start working with, MSPs that we know really know their stuff. Will there be a kind of an ecosystem or a supply?
Yeah, I don't know exactly how the dynamics are going to play out, but I would imagine it's not insane to imagine that there's going to be a post-rule demand shock, because everybody that you talk to is waiting on the rule before they get started. Now, there are a lot of early adopters that have already gotten started, right? We're doing just fine. Basically servicing people who are trying to get in line ahead of people. If you talk to the C3PAOs, they're booked out on assessments already until like March. And there's, I don't know, like 100 or 150 companies that have gone through the rigmarole of getting a joint surveillance assessment, pre-CMMC assessment that's allegedly going to convert into certification. And so, I have a colleague at 7.7, Daniel Akeridge, and he says this all the time. He's like, you can't be on time for this. Like, it's impossible to time it. You either have to be early or you're going to get stuck in this line and you're going to be very late. And if you have a wonderful relationship with your customer, or you have some sort of very specific negotiating position that allows you to go without a certification, then great. Then you know what's going on. Most people don't have that. Most people think they're a lot more special than they are. A lot of people think they're a lot more critical than they are. And they're going to be in for a rude awakening, because there isn't going to be like some monolithic reaction from the DoD where they just flip a switch and they say, we're no longer working with anybody who doesn't have a certification. I mean, that's the way that they make it out to be. But what's really going to happen is the phone is just going to start to ring less and less, right? And there isn't going to be any one belly button to push when this happens, because the DoD isn't a monolith. It's a series of components, systems commands, program managers that all have different preferences. And it's going to be too complicated to track in any one way. But once the policy comes out, if you don't have a plan, then you're just sort of hoping. And that's not a good strategy for anybody, let alone small businesses or MSPs with a portfolio of small businesses.
Yeah. So, Jacob, we're talking about CMMC, but let's kind of go beyond that in terms of this maybe setting a trend, right, to other areas of infrastructure and beyond in terms of regulations ahead. Like you mentioned GDPR. So based on like your view over the next 5 years, what do you think this will mean, like beyond DIB?
Yeah, I think that you throw a dart at any critical infrastructure sector in the US and everything is leaning towards regulation, because self attestation, self-certification, self-assessment doesn't work. And the thing that government wants is assurance that things are being implemented. And the market by itself does not reward the implementation of security. I mean, you can find case studies on that all day long. And so there has to be some mechanism that steps in to fill that gap. And that's clunky and it's not ideal. And it comes with a lot of trade-offs. But the language of this regulation is going to be the language of cybersecurity controls. So if I look long-term over the next 5 years, if you're not fluent in the language of the parts of security and GRC that everybody loves to hate, you're going to get left behind, because whether you believe it or not, whether you think it's actual security or not, your customers want assurances. And so it comes down to, how are you going to prove that you're doing these things for them? How are they going to prove that they're making you prove back and forth? It's all an assurance problem. We've sort of left the world, if any old timers remember the term information assurance, we've sort of left that discipline in the dust. And here it comes, because all the technology, all the innovation, all of the changes in the market, all of the evolution of cybersecurity as an industry, and nobody has any assurance that anything's actually happening. And that's what the regulations are looking after. You know, some examples, look at the healthcare sector, right? Healthcare is getting absolutely spanked. And you can read some of the letters from various Senate committees, House committees, various statements from people in Congress. They're freaking pissed about what's going on. They're like, what do you mean there is no universal standard of minimum cyber requirements? What do you mean there's no proof that anybody is implementing these requirements? What do you mean people are taking federal dollars and they aren't protecting covered federal information and allowing this to happen? Sound familiar? You replace the healthcare sector with the defense sector, and we're right back to 2019, 2020. Look at the water sector, right? You can look at Department of Education, like I just posted on LinkedIn this morning, is going to release a rule this fall about 800-171 requirements over student privacy information for any school that's taking federal grants from the Department of Education, which is everybody, because they need assurance that these things are happening. And sometimes the standards leave stuff that is to be desired and there's room for improvement, but there is no corner of industry or sector where you're going to get away from being able to be fluent in GRC.
But
it's just not going to happen.
Even without the regulation, what I'm seeing like on the street, right? And when we look at like our benchmarking, we see, sales, new recurring revenue sales for MSPs are going up as a percentage, of revenue, but we also see churn, and it's happening because customers, even those unregulated, are more educated, and they have now your competitors coming in and asking them questions. You know, like one small example, like in going through talking to a lot of MSPs, Andrew, I mentioned this a couple calls ago, how few people have the same amount of, MDR licenses as they do RMM. And now more and more people are. So if someone comes in and asks that question, right, you have an issue on your hands. So it's almost like SMBs are starting to force the poverty level up. That's not the way we're used to having it as MSPs. We're used to telling them when to change over from break and fix to MSP, when they should change something in security. That's why things have moved so slow, because as MSPs, we really have been the gatekeeper. Well, the customers are starting to be the gatekeeper. That's a much different paradigm. Before you even introduce any type of regulation, and you know who will help reinforce it as it comes, just like it's happened overseas? The customers.
Yeah.
But Gary, don't you think, PE is let me clarify. The fact that we're seeing the PE get into the market very heavily now in MSPs, and we're getting these very mature MSPs, a lot of scale behind them, et cetera. We never had the sophistication in sales forces that we do today. Is that also part of it? Educating on, in drove, some of these customers.
Yeah, it's all of it. It's the whole market. Customers are going through their digital revolution that the enterprise did, a couple decades ago.
Mm-hmm.
They're spending more and more on technology, and you combine all of these things. They're more educated about cybersecurity. In certain industries, they're seeing the regulation come, and all of it has led to a customer base that is asking questions for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's why we're pushing so hard every week on this call, right?
Yeah. Did you see that, Eric? When you were at Logicalis, obviously, like Gary said, digital evolution happened a lot more in the mid-market and enterprise before SMB. Did you see any of those trends?
100%. Yeah, it always trickles down. It just does, right? It starts with the big guys and then ultimately ends up in the SMB side of the MSP space. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I tell people this sometimes, depending on their level of doubt, if you're talking specifically about CMMC regulations, but if you want to talk about PE dynamics and what's going on in the investment world, out of the handful of MSPs that are strictly focused on the defense space, none of them have been able to not take PE money. So, I sometimes tell that to defense contractors who maybe think that this isn't real. I'm like, well, the people with the money have invested on the basis that their analysis says that it's real. And they usually do a pretty good job of due diligence before they spend their money. And so when every MSP that's specifically targeted on regulated spaces has, been approached by external investors, that should be a signal to people, regardless of your opinion of the standard or whatever. Follow the money. Follow the money.
Yeah,
those businesses and they trade 2 to 3 turns at least higher because the PE recognizes the potential.
Yeah,
they don't have to compete with the same level of competition.
Yeah, and there's I've heard all kinds of crazy stories. It'll be interesting. I wish the DOJ was faster. Everybody wishes the government moved faster and everything. CMMC, am I right? But I've heard some crazy stories about PE firms buying companies that have cybersecurity requirements, and then the DOJ talking about going after the PE firms because when those companies said we need to spend money on XYZ, they were like, no, because they're trying to maximize their investments. So there's all kinds of ways that the DOJ stuff can spin out and influence what's going on.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I had one more question. I'm going to skip it because I want to get over, based on time, I want to get over to you, Eric.
Okay. Yeah. Fantastic. Thanks, Gary. So, Jacob, I've heard you say in the past that when it comes to cybersecurity, you can either tax, subsidize, or regulate.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that? What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah. So I'm not an economist, but
it sounds it sounds very economist.
I've found myself reading more and more about economics as I've tried to understand more and more about the dynamics that are at play. And we've all seen it. We can all feel it. People in chat are talking about it, right? Saying you really ought to do this. And people go, well, am I going to make money on it? right? If it's just a cost, am I going to get anything for it? And the definition of what they call in economics an externality is when your individual decision has costs collectively that you don't bear, right? If I own a factory and I dump toxic waste into the river, right, that is cheaper for me, but it's very expensive for everybody else. And I don't necessarily bear the cost of the pollution while everybody else does.
Unless you get caught.
Exactly. And so in order to fix what they call a market failure, right, there's really only so many things that you can do. For instance, look at it as a market failure for any of these major breaches, right? Even SolarWinds isn't out of business, right? They're slowly creeping on their way back up. They took a big hit, but generally there's been some analysis out there from people like Kelly Shortridge that the market doesn't necessarily punish people for having bad security. It certainly doesn't incentivize you for having better security unless you're in a regulated space or you have a very specific set of customers that happen to care about that kind of thing. So when you have these market failures, there's really only so many options in economics for correcting them. One is a corrective tax, right? You're basically taxing the behavior that you want to stop. Is a corrective
like
subsidy.
Emissions is a good example.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
You're taxing carbon essentially in order to deal with pollution and emissions. Subsidies, which incentivize the behavior that you want people to take on. For instance, good example of that is research and development, right? Research and development is very expensive for organizations that do it, but it's very beneficial for everyone else. So we actually systemically underinvest in research and development, which is why the government has to fund research grants. It's why research and development in universities, except for Georgia Tech, is very allegedly is very important, right? Because the market isn't responding to this need. And so if we're not going to tax bad security, which we're definitely not going to, and if we're not going to subsidize good security, which it doesn't look like anybody's going to do that anytime soon, there's really only one lever left, and that's regulation. And that comes with a lot of trade-offs because it's an imperfect tool. It's slow. It just has a lot of issues, but it's the only lever that the government has left to pull
and it is,
when the market fails.
It's the same as a tax, because what will happen is the tax that IT providers will pay is they won't have the same market opportunity.
Yeah.
Right. So
there are definite.
It'll affect them commercially.
Yeah, there are definite trade-offs.
Let's push up on regulation just a little bit more then. So you take just the MSPs on this call, right? Their organizations touch a tremendous amount of critical infrastructure, right? So for as long as I've been involved in the MSP community, which has been pretty much since the beginning of the MSP community, there's been discussions of regulation of the MSP community. I'd love your thoughts on if you could look into your crystal ball, where do you see that going?
Sure. Well, three things on that topic. One is, can we swear on this podcast? It is fucking absurd that the infrastructure providers for critical infrastructure are not themselves considered to be critical infrastructure. I mean, that is slouching towards Armageddon all day long. That is completely insane. And that's regardless of whether I was saying that before I worked for an MSP, right? One of the reasons why I wanted to venture into the MSP industry was to learn more about it, because I was like, this is totally crazy. Second to that, there are some early indicators that future is in store for everybody. The first example is the revisions to NIST SP 800-171. They are going to tailor in more and more security controls that loop in difficult questions for MSPs, specifically in terms of how are you dealing with external providers. So the most recent revision, 800-171 revision 3, has controls that are tailored in that are asking, what are you doing with your external providers? What controls are they implementing? What do your agreements say? So we're starting to see these controls start to crop into these new revisions of baseline standards. If you look at the CMMC rule as the second example, there's language in the proposed rule that came out in December that said that MSPs themselves need the certification that their clients need when their clients are handling the data. Now, that's a open legal debate as far as what will happen with that provision in the rule, but you can see the government starting to paw at the door, trying to get their head around, like, what are these organizations? What exactly is it that you're doing? Because if you zoom out, if everyone is below the cyber poverty line in terms of the average client, And it just makes good business sense to outsource this skill set that's expensive that you wouldn't do in-house. Then anytime you're going to regulate a group of companies, you are necessarily by proxy regulating the MSPs. So the much more efficient way of regulating these systems and sectors would be to regulate the MSPs first, but they're not a critical infrastructure sector. There's no one in charge of them. This is a growing problem that I think awareness in the Beltway is increasing around. It's something that we beat the drum around all the time. I mean, our I'm going to tell you this, our business is around being a MSP in a regulated market. So we have a lot of conversations with people in DC being like, you should really take a second look at this whole industry over here, because when you say defense contractors, you need to do this, you're actually saying those MSPs need to do this. And when they're not doing it, it's actually the MSPs that are not doing it. So it's going to take a while, but for Gary's 5-year, preview down the road, I would be stunned if there isn't more attention on MSPs as an industry sector. It's absurd that it's not.
So Jacob, we've spent much of the last 2 cyber calls talking about CMMC and the DIB and all that. So, but not every MSP has customers involved in the DIB. But
Sure.
So what can they take away from what's happening with CMMC?
Yeah, well, the first thing is 800-171 is not a defense-specific standard. It's a federal-wide standard for protecting CUI, and CUI categories transcend all sectors and agencies. So I think that the most valuable thing for paying attention to the defense space and the CMMC rollout is the way that the DIB is breaking, the way that the rulemaking process is exposing pain points in this sector is an example of what will happen when the other sectors start to do this, right? I don't think it's a coincidence that the other sectors are watching what's going on with the DoD, taking flack, getting this process through, and then they're all going to jump on once it's codified in black and white. So, like I said, this is not an anomaly. This is a leading indicator for when an agency decides that they're going to get serious and they're going to turn the screws on their contractors, on the people that they're in charge of through whatever legal authority, stuff breaks. And if you think that it's not going to happen for your healthcare sector clients or your Department of Education sector clients, wake up, look around.
Well, I was just going to ask Eric if I could real quick.
Yeah.
To SLTTs, we talk about this a lot with Phyllis and, the MSISAC, Jacob, they take a lot of federal grant money. So isn't that an area where an MSPs, arguably support 60+% of SLTTs?
Yeah.
Isn't that going to be an area where we want to look?
Yeah.
Where federal money is being delivered?
Yep. Absolutely.
Hey, I want to mention something you said, Eric. I saw a comment by Ryan. He said, when we talk to an MSP who finds out they have a DIB contractor client, they usually start asking questions that reveal many other DIB clients. It's hidden churn. So I closed with this comment, last week, but I want to repeat it. The first thing I would do if I was an MSP today is I would start having a conversation with my VCIOs. I'm saying in the next month, quarter at the latest, asking questions around this, because many times MSPs don't have a relationship with many of their customers that even tells them whether they're going to have some risk in their customer base. Like, that is step one.
Yeah.
Agreed.
I think that if you have taken over an MSP recently, if you have pivoted your business recently, and you've got legacy clients or anything like that, if your clients have pivoted into a new kind of work, and you or someone in your MSP has promised them, hey, it's all good, we got it, you definitely want to scrape through what you've told people, because we see it every day. I mean, we've been seeing the uptick over the last 6 months or so, especially where pre-CMMC, it's not technically done yet, still in rulemaking, right? Pre-CMMC, the large mega prime contractors, the Lockheeds, the Raytheons, the Northrops, they're like, hey, we need answers to these questions. And if you stumble or hesitate, they're like, bye, call us when you're ready.
Yeah.
And so there's going to be a lot of people out there who have agreements with their MSPs. And if they get cut from that work, they're going to start coming after you. So
Yep,
I'm not trying to scare everybody, right? It's only FUD if it's not true. It's happening.
So Andrew, I know we're running super short on time. You want to get in your last couple of questions?
Yeah, my while we have people, I just like, your take on, we talked to Ryan about, where rulemaking is last week. I just like your comments, Jacob, on, we're at the part, right, where we're going to allow for public, I may not be saying it perfectly, right, Jacob? Comments, right? Yeah. Can you kind of walk us through today, what's going to happen?
Sure.
And kind of the process from there.
Yeah. So as the timeline stands right now, the CMMC program is implemented by 2 different rules. They're on 2 different timelines. The first one, the big one, codifies the CMMC policy for the department. And so that rule is set to go, as far as I've heard, the final rule should be published like by mid-September, which means that it will be in effect before the end of this year, at which point CMMC assessments would theoretically be commercially available. They're not a requirement in contracts, but companies would be able to go out and get CMMC certifications because the program is live. The second rule is the one that DoD will use to put the requirements in their contracts. That one, based off what we know right now, should be final and effective in the summer of 2025. There's some reasons to believe that it will go faster, but conservatively, I'm going to tell you summer of 2025. And at that point, all bets are off, because that's where you can no longer control DoD as a monolithic organization. Program manager and contract officer discretion will allow them to insert requirements into contracts as they see fit. And so that's why you're seeing all these prime contractors reach out to their subs right now saying, what level are you going to be? When are you going to be ready? Because they need to know when they bid on a contract in the summer of 2025 that's going to get awarded a few months later, which one of their subcontractors are going to come with them. So the further people are down in the supply chain, actually, the faster they need to be certified. But I would say, as we know right now, CMMC will be final and effective this year, commercially available Q1, in contracts summer 2025.
It's interesting. I'd love to hear from folks in chat if they've heard from customers, hey, downstream in the supply chain, right, Jay? Because you're saying you're seeing it from prospects.
Oh yeah, there's subcontractors right now getting cut off from working with Raytheons and Lockheeds and Northrops because they aren't giving them the warm and fuzzy about their ability to have their requirements proven. So,
and shit rolls downhill.
Man, Gary, I'm so glad you said that. I was in the Navy for 8 years. The DoD invented this term. They invented the term that it rolls downhill. And everybody who's a subcontractor at the bottom of the hill is like, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, we all talk about how long it's taken. From the DoD's perspective, they're like, we've told you for 5 years to get ready. So it's, don't be surprised when it actually happens.
Yeah. And I guess in the last few minutes, Jacob, anything surprise you in terms of the rulemaking, in terms of where we are?
The thing that has surprised me the most is how fast the rule went from its publication in December to its final submission in June. So it took us a long time to get the policy rule, the secondary rule together. That's part of the reason why things have taken so long. But they published that rule in December. They had 1,800 public comments on a 250-page rule. It's one of the biggest rulemaking efforts the Department of Defense has ever had, as far as I am aware. They successfully adjudicated and responded to all of those public comments, made whatever tweaks they made to the rule, buttoned it up, and submitted it for final review at OMB in 6 months, which is 50% faster than average for DoD rulemaking. That is extremely surprising, because that is a monumental administrative bureaucratic effort. Really, the takeaway from that is nothing in the rule has really changed, because you don't blow through 1,800 public comments and then submit the final draft 6 months later if you're going back and completely hacking the rule apart and reinventing everything. So what we saw in December is what we're going to see here in a week or two, probably. And then I'm not going to say I told you so, but I hope everybody's been doing what they say they've been doing all along.
Right.
Maybe we close with this, Andrew. I'm thinking about what Phyllis said last week, is that if you really look at this, the core of it is CIS, right? IG1. The things that are outside of that are like some of the hard things you can't automate. There's some physical controls and those kind of things. But everyone can be having the right hygiene today. Taking away all the rules where we need to be. I don't feel like every MSP is doing all the things at that minimum level they need to do for every one of their customers.
Yep.
And I was talking to a very large MSP last week, and this person said to me, like, well, yeah, but we have some of our customers who don't want to, pay for that. I'm like, good God, man. You're kidding me. It's 2024. You're still blaming your customer?
Yeah.
Stop it.
And I mean, that's why the regulations exist, because, there has to be a forcing function. But like I said, the regulations come with a lot of extra baggage, is one way to put it. And so, you got to be fluent in that, in being a baggage handler for all these regulations, because, more and more, it's just going to keep accumulating.
Oh, great. Jacob, thanks so much for coming on. I know we're the hour here. For those of you that joined us in the crowd out there and attended and made comments, thank you as always. We really appreciate you joining us each and every Monday. We'll be off next Monday, back the following. Eric, thanks as always for jumping in here and filling in and giving some the legal perspective. Gary, as always, awesome seeing you, pal.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great holiday.
Bye.